master's program, and again for admission to my doctoral program, which I'm currently in. So I'm very familiar with the exam and the process, and hopefully we'll be able to answer some questions for you today so that you can start preparing for the graduate record exam yourself. So just a brief overview of what we're going to talk about today. We're going to talk a little bit about what the graduate record exam is and how it's structured, and then look a little bit at each of the sections, the analytical writing, quantitative reasoning, and verbal reasoning components of the exam, and then we'll open it up for some questions, which hopefully I'll be able to answer for you. If at any point in time you do have questions throughout the presentation and you just want to put those in the queue, use the chat feature on the right-hand side of the room so we can start collecting those questions there. So the GRE, or Graduate Record Exam, is an exam that we administer regularly throughout the world in different test centers to evaluate a student's readiness for graduate level education. And certainly an exam is not the only indicator of one's readiness to engage in graduate study, but it is one of the most common requirements for admission to a graduate program in the United States, in addition to the completion of a bachelor's level equivalent degree program. There's two formats for the graduate record exam. There's what we call the GRE general test, which is what most graduate students end up taking as part of their admissions process. And then there's the GRE subject matter tests. And those subject tests might be required by certain graduate programs for admission to their particular discipline. Those subject tests include biology, biochemistry, psychology, chemistry, mathematics, English literature, and physics. And again, that might be a requirement for admission to a particular graduate program in addition to the GRE general test. All of the information regarding the graduate record exam can be found online at www.ets.org/GRE, and that includes information regarding test locations, registration, and the requirements of what you'll need to do the day of the exam. Currently, the fees are set for this academic year at $205 US for the general test and $150 US for the subject matter tests. It is important to make sure that when you schedule your test, you are able to get to the testing center the day of, because there is a rescheduling fee and paperwork that you will need to complete if you are unable to show up for the exam on the day that you're scheduled. So some things to do before you register for the exam. You want to look first at the actual programs of study that you wish to apply to. Not every master's and PhD program in the United States requires the GRE for admission. A number do. For instance, my master's program, which was in education, we had the option of submitting GRE scores, but they were not required unless the GPA for the bachelor's degree was under a certain level. I think it was a 3.25 out of 4.0 GPA. And so you want to look at each program that you're applying to and see, does this program require the graduate record exam or does it not? If it does require the GRE, you'll want to see which GREs they require. Is it just the general test, or do they require a subject test for your particular discipline? Again, a number of programs do require that subject matter test, though not all do. So for instance, you might find that a couple of the biology master's programs you might want to apply to do require the subject test, and a number of them may not. So you just want to make sure you're clear on the testing requirements for the institutions of interest. You'll also, while you're researching admission to the program, you'll want to look and see what scores are considered competitive for each program. So when you do take the GRE and you get your initial score report, you'll be able to make some informed decisions about the competitiveness of the programs that you wish to apply to. Last but not least, you want to check the application deadline. Graduate record exam scores generally take between 10 and 15 business days to be delivered to the institutions after the exam is taken. And so if you are coming up against that deadline and you're applying to a program and the application closes the week after you take the GRE, you will probably not have a complete admissions kit for that program, and they will not review your application. Graduate admissions work a bit differently than undergraduate admissions, and there's very little, if any, flexibility around those deadlines. There are some programs as well that do not require the graduate record exam or might require an alternative to that exam. So for instance, if you're thinking about studying medicine in the United States, generally we require the medical college admissions test, or MCAT, and that is a very different format and requires a very different application process. If you're planning on pursuing a Juris Doctor or law degree, you'll want to take the law school admissions test, or LSAT. And a number of business programs, like Master of Business Administration programs in the United States, may require the GMAT, or General Management Admissions Test, instead of the graduate record exam. That's not across the board. There's a number of MBA programs that do require the graduate record exam, but some require the GMAT. So just make sure you're checking on those requirements prior to applying to take any of the exams. It is also always beneficial to make contact with an admissions advisor at the program that you're interested in studying at, to make sure that you're clear about the expectations that you see on the website. So let's talk a little bit about the GRE general test. Unfortunately, for time today, we're not going to be able to get into the subject-specific tests, but if that's something you would like some more information on, just make sure you're communicating with Anita, and I will pull together some materials specific to those. But again, each of the prospectus for the exams, for the general and subject exams, are on that ets.org website. So just feel free to go to the web and look up the requirements for those specific exams. So the general test, as I mentioned, assesses readiness for graduate level education. We do this by assessing verbal reasoning, quantitative or numerical reasoning, analytical writing, and critical thinking. And the critical thinking component is not a standalone part of the test, but rather is woven throughout the entire exam. The GRE is offered year-round in various test centers and locations throughout the world, and you can register for that online, and you'll be able to put in your address and figure out what the closest test centers are to you to register for that exam. As I mentioned, scores are generally sent 10 to 15 working days after the exam has been administered. You can retake the computer-based exam after 21 days. So there's a three-week hold period where you're not allowed to retake the exam. But say you take the exam and you get your initial score report at the end of the exam and you're dissatisfied with the outcome, you could register to retake the exam after that 21-day waiting period. You can also retake the exam up to 5 times in any 12-month period. So you are able to retake it essentially as many times as you need to get the scores that you need. But again, remember that you're going to want to anticipate the amount of time it'll take for the scores to post and send to the institutions of record. So while the GRE does allow you to retake up to 5 times, it's unlikely, if you're looking at admissions for next fall, that you will be able to take the exam up to 5 times to get the scores that you want. So this is where test preparation is very, very important, and we'll speak to that in a moment. Your unofficial verbal and quantitative reasoning scores are given to you immediately upon completion of the computer-based assessment, which is nice because it gives you an opportunity to see how you did, and we'll talk briefly about what those scores mean. But you can kind of see how you did initially. Those scores may change slightly when you get your final and official score report because of the way the GRE is benchmarked against the other people taking the exam in the same testing period. So when you get that official score report, you will get the actual numbers for your verbal reasoning and quantitative reasoning sections, and the final score for your analytical writing, which they do not give you immediately upon completion because that needs to be assessed by test reviewers manually. So they are unable to give you an immediate score once you complete the exam. But your score report will show those three scores, and then they'll also give you a percentile as to how you performed against other people in the same testing block. So you may have a very, very competitive score and see that it's in the 88th percentile, which means that your score was at or above 88% of the people that took the exam on the day that you took the exam. So that'll give you a bit of an idea of how competitive your scores are against others who have also taken the GRE, not just against the institutions that you wish to apply to. At the time of the test, you'll be able to designate up to 4 institutions of higher education to receive your scores. You can request additional score reports. So if you decide that you want to apply to a 5th or 6th institution, you can request additional score reports later, and there is an additional cost assessed. I don't have that number right in front of me, but I think it was something like $25 or $30 for an additional score report. And I can find that number for you if that's something you're interested in. So the computer-based test is broken up as such. There's an analytical writing section with 2 writing tasks, and these are actually composition sections. So you will actually write an essay. Each of these essays is limited to 30 minutes, and so we'll talk briefly about what those look like in a few moments. Verbal reasoning, there are 2 30-minute sections, which are each composed of 20 questions. So you'll have 20 questions over the course of a 30-minute period. This is important to keep in mind as you are practicing for the exam so that you can time yourself accordingly. You'll only have approximately 1 minute to 1.5 minutes per question to answer, which is it doesn't feel like a very long time, particularly on the verbal reasoning section where you actually have to read passages of text. The quantitative reasoning section is composed of 2 35-minute sections, each 20 questions. As a result, you'll want to, again, time accordingly because quantitative reasoning involves some math problems, but also some verbal problems with quantitative analysis. So you might have a story problem, for instance, that you need to read and respond to a couple of questions based on that prompt. There may be on some of your exams an additional unidentified, unscored section that's used for research purposes. So occasionally the ETS, Educational Testing Service, will want to explore new types of questions. They'll want to make sure that these questions are functioning correctly for the upcoming test cycle. And so you might have an unidentified, unscored section that you won't actually know which section that is. So you'll want to perform as effectively as you can on any section that you're provided. A question came through. In verbal, is reading part of the 30 minutes, or does the time start after one reads the text? That's a good question. It's 30 minutes for the entire section. So you will have 30 minutes to read passages and respond to questions. There's generally a few questions for each of the passages. So it's not like you will have to read a passage and then respond to one question, read another passage and respond to one question. There's only a couple of passages for the verbal reasoning section, and we'll discuss in a few minutes what exactly the verbal reasoning section looks like. I hope that's helpful. There is a paper form test, and the paper form test is only administered in areas where there are no computer-based testing centers, and they're only administered 3 times per year. The format is a little bit different. You have a little bit longer time frame to respond to those, and you'll need to set up a proctor to be able to track that timing and everything. So again, hopefully most of you have a computer-based testing center at least somewhere close to you, but a paper test form does exist if you need it, and the fee structure is the same for the paper test as the computer-based test. So in order to begin preparing for the graduate record exam, you'll want to go onto the GRE website and start reviewing the materials. The GRE website has a number of really wonderful resources, including full explanations of what is expected out of each section of the exam, practice questions that you can attempt, and then look at the answers to kind of evaluate yourself on how you did, and some test-taking strategies as well. Those materials are generally free on their website, though the ETS website does publish some types of materials that you might have to pay for if you would like to do that. I would recommend, as you're preparing, taking the full-length practice tests in an area that's quiet and free of distractions. So a situation like an office or something like that that would be very similar to the environment that you would encounter at a testing center. After reviewing your practice test and looking at how you did, you can use that to identify your areas of strength and your areas of struggle, those areas that you most need improvement in. And then you can tailor your preparation strategy accordingly. So for me, when I took the graduate record exam the first time and the second time, I took a practice exam first. That was the very first thing that I did. And then once I finished the practice exam, I went back and scored myself and kind of saw where the areas were that I needed the most support and went back and reviewed those items. I was able to, from the practice exam to the actual administration of the GRE, improve my score pretty dramatically as a result of looking at those areas of weakness and improving in those areas. There are some materials out there that would recommend that you practice the most difficult questions only, and my recommendation would actually be to practice the typical questions, the types of questions that are most often asked. And again, the GRE website will have a lot of that information on it. The reason I say that is because those incredibly hard questions are very difficult potentially difficult to study for specifically, and if you spend too much time preparing one type of question, you're going to miss a lot of other things on the exam. So I recommend practicing those typical types of questions, and those are the types of questions we'll talk through in a couple minutes here when we look at each section. I also recommend talking through questions aloud. This might just be a strategy that works for me, but it may work for you as well. While you can't talk aloud in the testing center because it's a quiet testing environment, practicing questions by speaking through them aloud during your practice time, it can be very helpful and can be a way to hear and see things that you otherwise wouldn't. Some of us do very well with just reading as a learning strategy. Some of us need to hear things, and so talking through questions out loud can be very, very helpful. I mentioned that there's a certain number of questions for a certain time frame, so I recommend practice pacing yourself through each of the test sections. Have a timer going and make sure that you are practicing pacing accordingly so you can get through the entire section in the amount of time allocated. And this is kind of metaphorically, it's a marathon, not a sprint. So you don't want to rush through the questions, but you also don't want to take so much time on any one question that you fail to answer other questions in the section. So again, pacing is very important. Another thing that is very important is that you review mathematical concepts. It may have been a number of years since the last time that you took a math course, and if that's the case, you'll want to review especially basic arithmetic, algebra, and geometry. And if you've taken coursework in, say, calculus or differential equations, it can feel odd I guess, to try to study for basic arithmetic, algebra, and geometry, but those are the bodies of knowledge that they draw the questions from. There are no calculus questions on the GRE, and so you're going to have to go back potentially and review some of that material. And also in preparation, I always recommend, especially for the verbal and analytical writing sections, to read a variety of different types of material. Read scholarly journals in your discipline, read newspapers, read fiction books, and just absorb as much information as you can in English so that you can have a lot more to draw on when you're beginning to compose, especially your analytical writing section. Usually you'll want to take the GRE in the late summer or early fall of the year prior to applying to graduate school. And the reason for that is twofold. First, generally in the United States, our application deadlines are in December for the upcoming academic year, so they're earlier than our undergraduate programs. And so you'll want to make sure you have plenty of time to take the exam and then retake the exam if you need to. The other thing that I would recommend then, if you're planning to take it in late summer or early fall, is to begin your preparation for the exam at least 6 to 8 weeks prior. So for instance, I took the GRE in August, the last time I took it, and I started my test preparation in March of that year. So I started preparing in March. I took the test in August. I was satisfied with my scores, which were sent to my institutions in early September, and I was able to get my entire application kit done for my doctoral programs well in advance of the deadline. When I'm doing test preparation with students, there's always a question about how much should I study and how much maybe is too much to study. I like to encourage people to set aside 3 to 4 hours each week for regular study, and that doesn't have to be one consistent block of time. Most of us can't study for 4 straight hours without getting up and taking a break and moving around. So you might set aside a couple of 2-hour blocks during the week that are dedicated to your GRE preparation. If you struggle with any of the content the initial time that you take the practice GRE, you'll want to plan to increase your study phase to about 3 to 6 months so that you have adequate time to prepare for those sections that you need the most support around. Again, you can find test preparation materials online. There's a number of different companies that produce free and accessible online materials. And you could also borrow materials from a local library or American Corner or what have you. Or you can purchase materials if you have the ability to do so from one of the test preparation vendors. And there's a lot of them on there out there in the world. When I went to purchase test prep materials, I just went to Amazon.com and read reviews about each of the materials I was thinking about purchasing, and then settled on the one exam preparation booklet that I wanted. There's really no need to purchase a substantial amount of materials because there's so much free and accessible on the internet. On the day of the test, you'll want to bring your registration confirmation and required identification, and all of the ID requirements can be found on the GRE website. You really do need to plan this out in advance because there's going to be requirements for the testing center that you'll need to abide. So for instance, they may require certain types of photo ID, but may not allow other types of photo ID. For instance, most testing centers will not accept a student identification card from a college or university. So you'll want to plan accordingly for that. On rare occasion, if there's an issue with identification, the test center can request supplemental ID. So I always recommend bringing 2 forms of identification with you to the day of the exam if you are able to do so. Dress comfortably and appropriate to fluctuations in temperature. I mentioned that I took my exam in August. In the States, it's very warm in August. It's a very, very hot time of the year. My testing center was incredibly cold because of the air conditioning. So thankfully, I brought a sweater with me to wear during the exam. Otherwise, I probably would have been shaking the entire time, which would have been very distracting. Generally, food, beverages, tobacco products, and firearms are not allowed in the testing center, so you'll want to plan that accordingly. The one exception is if you have some sort of a medical condition that requires that you eat food or drink beverage at a certain interval of time, that you would want to request that in advance with the GRE to make sure they can accommodate that need. You'll also not be able to bring any personal electronic devices, cell phones, or the like with you. That includes calculators. There's for the computer-based test, there's a built-in calculator on the GRE test, so you can use it in the module. If you are doing the paper form test, they will tell you what the requirements are and what you're allowed to bring in regard to a calculator. But a calculator on your cell phone would not be allowed. So let's look at each of the three sections for a few minutes and give you an idea of what to expect out of each of these sections. The analytical writing section, again, is the section that you're going to actually be composing original thoughts for. And so when you look at the format of that analytical writing section, there are two tasks. There's a 30-minute section where you analyze an issue, and so you're given a passage of text, and then you're given a prompt for how to analyze that. And the second is analyze an argument. Again, you're given a passage of text, and that passage of text will be followed by a prompt, and the prompt will ask you to assess the argument itself. So I will show you what each of those two sections look like momentarily. So when you're, unlike the rest of the GRE, which is scored on a very different numerical scale, the analytical writing is scored on a scale of 0 to 6. And so 6 is the high end of the score, and it demonstrates exceptional, complex thinking, well-developed arguments, and a well-reasoned essay. This is at the highest end. When the assessors are going through and scoring, they are looking for a coherent, thoughtful, and articulate argument. What they also are looking for is something that's reasonable to have accomplished within 30 minutes. And so most of us can't compose a thesis level paragraph or a thesis, very, very thoughtful thesis level writing ability in a half hour on a prompt that we have just been introduced to. And the assessors know this. So what they're looking for is well organized, well developed arguments. The scores are represented in half point increments, so there's 6, 5.5, 5, 4.5, etc. I just put on a couple of the benchmark scores here for your review. A 4 would be a competently written, fairly well organized essay that might include some errors in grammar, syntax, punctuation, or logic. And so this is still a pretty solid essay. Again, you'll want to look at each program specifically to see how heavily they weigh the analytical writing section of the GRE in their admissions decision. So for instance, my program that I'm in now accepted a 4 as the minimum score. And my score was higher than that, but they accepted 4 as their minimum score. And if somebody scored lower than a 4, they had to produce supplemental writing to the admissions committee to show that they could write at the doctoral level. A 2 would be a pretty weak essay, very disorganized, not answering the task effectively. A 0 would essentially be that the respondent didn't answer the question at all. So there may be something written, but it didn't answer any of the prompts. And so they would be given a score of a 0. There is also an option if you skip a section, you'll see on the score report an NS, or not scored, because there was nothing to score. Of course, this isn't something that you want to do, but that would be on the score report if somebody did skip a section, which occasionally people do for whatever reason. So the argument analysis task, essentially what you'll be asked to do here is you'll be provided a passage that makes claims that are backed up by reason and evidence. And so what you're actually doing is responding to the question based on that. It's not, unless it's indicated by the question, it's not your job to assess whether or not the argument that is made is true, or to get into your opinion about the argument and state whether you agree or disagree with the arguments. This is not the particular section for doing that. So let me show you an example of an argument task question. So you'd be given a passage of text, a couple of paragraphs that you would need to read. So you'll want to factor in the reading of that into your time frame. And you'll want to write a response which answers the task at hand. So for instance, the italicized text here, write a response in which you discuss what questions would need to be answered in order to decide whether the recommendation and the argument on which it is based are reasonable. Be sure to explain how the answers to these questions would help evaluate the recommendation. And so your writing task has two components. First, to discuss those questions that you have around the paragraph or text that's provided. What don't you know that you need to know? And secondly, explain how getting answers to those questions would help you to evaluate the recommendation. Again, you're not assessing whether you believe the recommendation or not. You are simply answering the task at hand in a logical and coherent manner. The analyze an issue task is a little bit different, though structurally they're similar. You'll still be provided a passage of text that you'll need to respond to. It's usually a general interest kind of topic, so nothing so narrow and specific that you wouldn't be able to draw on some life experience to write about. So you're essentially in this task writing a position statement based on the prompt that's provided. So you may be given a small passage of text and then given a question like this. Write a response in which you discuss the extent to which you agree or disagree with the claim. In developing and supporting your position, be sure to address the most compelling reasons and/or examples that could be used to challenge your position. And so this question, again, is asking for two things: your disagreement or agreement with the claim and the reasons why. So you'll want to address both as you're writing the section. So this section does ask for your opinion, but I would caution that a purely opinion-based essay will not score very high. The argument task really, the issue task really wants you to be able to assess the claim being made and the extent to which you agree or disagree with it, and then back it up with facts and evidence. This is very different than a purely opinion-based essay where you would write something like, no, I disagree wholeheartedly with this because I just think it's wrong. You'll want to provide very good reasons and examples as to why you would challenge this particular position or why you would support the claim. As you're preparing for the analytical writing section, again, I think it's always great to read extensively so you have inspiration upon which to draw. Again, read scholarly works in and out of your discipline, periodicals, popular journalism, books, and novels, particularly fiction. And the reason that I say particularly fiction is sometimes the way that fiction writers present arguments is a little different than we do in nonfiction, and it can give you some additional inspiration from which to draw. When you get into the task, you'll have 30 minutes again, so you'll want to, on the front end, read the question and make sure you understand it. Outline quickly on scratch paper what you want to write about. So you may organize 3 to 5 paragraphs where you say a general statement about agreeing or disagreeing, evidence 1, evidence 2, evidence 3, conclusion. So you write a compelling essay, albeit a very short one. It will be very short. And your outline helps with logic and flow. You'll want to practice writing succinct and powerful statements with well-reasoned arguments. Again, we are not looking for a dissertation or thesis level on this. We're looking for what you can accomplish within 20 to 30 minutes. You should ask a faculty member or a mentor to review your writing, and as you practice your prompts, make sure that they are logical and understandable. Um, Again, this is a pacing issue, but you'll want to make sure that you have time to read the prompt, develop your idea, and write your essay. When you write the essay, you'll be typing it into a word processor. That word processor will not have spell and grammar check on it. And the assessors know this, and so they're willing to give some flexibility to basic syntactical errors. But if you continue to make the same errors over and over again, they are going to drop your score. So just make sure that you are reviewing that. The analytical writing sections from previous tests are posted on the GRE website so that you can read them, and then they provide examples of a 6, a 5, a 4, a 3, and a 2. So you can look at the type of writing that would garner each type of score. The quantitative reasoning section of the test is where we get into numerical computation. And there are some students who do very, very well on this section and never have an issue with it. Those tend to be students coming in from the hard sciences and mathematics disciplines, technology, engineering, those types of fields. And this can occasionally be a challenge for those of us who are in humanities, education, and social sciences who maybe haven't used those quantitative reasoning components recently. I'm going to pause really quick for a question. Can we use paper and pencil to write notes about issues and arguments? So this is referring back to the analytical writing section. Yes, absolutely. The test center will provide you scratch paper and pencils so that you can do that. And I found that very beneficial. So if you could visualize with me, when I wrote each essay, on the left-hand side of my scratch paper, I outlined very briefly the major headings that I wanted to include. And then to the right of that, a couple of bullet points of ideas that I wanted to include in each section. And then I wrote based on that. Again, this isn't, unfortunately, enough time to really fully form deep thoughts and ideas, but sketching out an outline on a scratch paper can be very helpful. You're very welcome. All right, quantitative reasoning. What does this section look like? There are 35-minute sections, there's 2 of them, and there's 20 questions in each section. The old form of the graduate record exam used to have increasing difficulty on the questions. So you would start easy and build up to more intense questions the later you got in the exam. The new form of the GRE that was released about 2 years ago eliminated that metric, and so now it's within the section. So there's no order of difficulty within the first quantitative reasoning section that you do. The questions might start very hard and get easier, or they might be a mix of hard and easy throughout. And so there's no real rhyme or reason to how difficult the questions are in sequence within a section. However, how you perform on the first section will determine the difficulty of the questions asked in the second section. So if you are not performing particularly well on the first section, the questions will not be as difficult on the second section. And if you perform very well, you might find that the questions are very difficult on the second section. Each question, though, regardless of its difficulty, receives equal weight in the scoring. So you have 40 total questions between the 2 sections, which means your score for the mathematics section, the quantitative reasoning section, ranges from 130 to 170 points. And again, the point values seem fairly arbitrary for those of us who are used to working on a 100-point scale or a 4-point scale. This is a very arbitrary scoring system. But generally speaking, on the quantitative section, you'll want to score on the higher end of that range to have a competitive score, closer to 160 or more. Your institutions will tell you exactly what the minimum cutoff requirements are for the quantitative reasoning section for your discipline. Generally, again, science, technology, engineering, mathematics require higher scores on the quantitative reasoning section, but in the humanities, social sciences and things, they may require slightly lower scores on the quantitative reasoning section. The quantitative reasoning section, I think some students think that that there's going to be complex equations, calculus, and those types of fields on here. Thankfully, the quantitative reasoning section is composed of basic arithmetic, algebra, geometry, and data analysis. So as long as you've had a second course in algebra in your college mathematics sequence, or a statistics course, you should be able to navigate most of what's in this section effectively. The biggest issue, though, is that most of the basic algebra, geometry, and arithmetic skills, it's been a while since we've taken courses in those, and so it warrants some review. Just make sure that you're taking that seriously. I think sometimes students see secondary level or high school mathematics and think, I don't have to study for this because it can't be that hard, and then they end up floundering on the exam because they haven't reviewed those basic concepts. So here's a sample question. So they may provide you this is a basic geometry example, some sort of a graph, a diagram, or something, and ask you to respond to a question. For instance, here you can see we have 4 options. You have on that S angle, you have an X degrees on the left side and a Y degrees on the right side. And they're asking, is quantity A greater, quantity B greater? Are the two quantities equal, or can you not determine the relationship based on the information? So just take a moment to think about this question and see what you come up with as an answer. And if you'd like to, if you feel like disclosing, want to post your answer in the chat feature, you can, or you can answer silently to yourself. Okay, we have a couple of C's. The two quantities are equal. Okay. Some of our students are saying C. So as you're looking at this particular example, this would be a geometry problem. You'd want to review some basic geometry before answering this question, because while the picture looks to be equilateral along the SU axis, each side, you don't actually know what the angle values are for that R angle or the T angle. So as a result, you can't determine the response given the information. So X and Y look similar, but they may not be. So you have to look at the basic concepts here. If R and T, those angles, are not equal, X and Y are not equal degrees. So we don't have enough information to assess this problem. So some recommendations as you're trying to get into the quantitative reasoning piece. And if you feel like you need some review on the quantitative reasoning, we can work to pull together another test prep session via webinar that would focus specifically on the quantitative reasoning section, and I am happy to pull that together. So again, try a few questions on a practice exam to determine the types of fields that you need to review, for instance, geometry or algebra. You will have a computer-based calculator, but practice doing manual calculations regardless. That way you can make sure that if your calculations aren't working, if the calculator freezes up, which it doesn't do, I hope, that you still have a backup option to do manual calculations. And you can do the manual calculations first and then use the calculator to confirm your answer, which generally in mathematics is always a good idea. Review those major topics and formulae from each of these disciplines. You'll want to look back at arithmetic, and basic numerical computation. You'll want to look at things like in algebra, like order of operations and factoring and those types of things. In geometry, things like the relationship of angles in a triangle and some of those types of things. I feel like there's the two times I took the GRE, it felt like there were a few questions out of each section that were dedicated to those types of shape relationships, angle measures, and things like that. And then you'll also want to review statistics and data analysis. So being able to look at a chart of information and determine the percentage of something. So you may be given a total number of people who believe in one platform and then a group of people who believe in another platform, and you're asked to assess the percentage of people that would agree with one or the other. So again, review those basic statistics and data analysis strategies. All of this information is on the GRE website, so you could pull practice exams and figure out what types of questions they're looking for. Read and reread the instructions so you know exactly what the question is asking. Most times, when a student has missed a question, it probably could have been avoided if they had read the instructions clearly. This is particularly important in quantitative reasoning if you're given a story problem. For instance, a paragraph of text from which you're asked to calculate data. You'll want to make sure you read that and reread it to be clear of what the question is asking. And as I already said, practice word problems as well as numerical problems. Not everything is going to be an equation that you need to factor. You are going to have word problems in the quantitative reasoning section as well. So verbal reasoning is the last of the three sections. The verbal reasoning is organized into two 30-minute sections, each with 20 questions. And there are three main types of questions that we're going to look at briefly here. Reading comprehension, text completion, and what we call sentence equivalence or sentence equivalency. Again, like the quantitative reasoning section, this is scored on a 1-point incremental scale from 130 to 170, 170 being the high end. Again, if you're being asked to, if you're looking into graduate programs, you should look at what the minimum cutoffs are for each section, not just the composite score. So that might be a phone call to the admissions counselor to get that specific information. So the reading comprehension section is organized as such. You will be asked to read a passage and then respond to one of three types of questions regarding the passage. So generally, you're given a passage of text and you have three, maybe four questions regarding that passage of text to respond to. Some of them are multiple choice, where you select one answer. Some are multiple choice, where you select all that apply. And some are select in passage. And so you may be asked to essentially fill in a blank in the middle of a passage, or be asked to respond which of the sentences in this particular passage speaks to this idea. And then you would have to find the sentence and highlight it. Let's do a text completion example. So in these types of questions, you'll be provided a passage and you must fill out the blanks in the text. And I didn't want to provide an example of a question with a prolonged passage to read, so I'm giving you an easier one here from one of my practice exams that I administer to students at my college. Vain and prone to violence, Caravaggio could not handle success. The more his blank as an artist increased, the more blank his life became. This type of question is asking you to fill in the first blank from blank 1 and the second blank from blank 2. So you're given two columns of text. I'll pause for a moment to allow you to read the passage again and determine which words best complete the text provided. And if you wish to share that in the chat feature, please do. Just put the two words that you would use to complete the sentence in that chat box. Okay, we have one response, eminence and dispassionate. Okay, okay. So a few different answers here. This speaks to an issue with the verbal reasoning section that I want to address briefly. You may find that there's multiple words that actually could fit. And so what the GRE is looking for is the best fit. Which word best fills? So for instance, let's break this down. We know that Caravaggio is vain and that he's prone to violence. So the second clause here, the more his blank as an artist increased, um, we could probably use eminence or notoriety. Temperance doesn't feel like a good fit here. And so we have to figure out which of these two words that are left are the best fit. And so notoriety is the best fit in this case because as an artist, his notoriety, his fame increasing. Eminence just doesn't quite fit as well. Although it could work, it's not the best fit. In the last clause, the more blank his life became. And we had both tumultuous and dispassionate. I think either of those could work, but I think that in this case, the GRE is looking for tumultuous. So the more his notoriety as an artist increased, the more tumultuous his life became. So in addition to speaking to an issue of the best fit for a particular question, this also speaks to another issue on the GRE verbal section, which is preparing your vocabulary. It's okay if you get it wrong now because it helps you highlight those areas that you might want to work on. This is not a problem. That's why we're doing this right now. I want you to make sure that you understand that the vocabulary section or this type of thing will be very, very helpful to vocabulary. There's a number of really great vocabulary lists out there on the internet that can help you prepare for the vocabulary type questions. A question came through, when it comes to point, would they accept half correct answers as half a point? Unfortunately, no. It's an all or nothing for each question on both quantitative and verbal. And so it gets scored on the full point. So if you missed one or both sections of this particular question, you would lose the point. Here's another example of a question of sentence equivalence. A sentence equivalence question provides a single sentence with one blank and six potential answers. The instructions for this section are that you are to select the two answers that you think fit. So if you read the blue italicized passage, select the two answer choices that, when used to complete the sentence, fit the meaning of the sentence as a whole and produce completed sentences that are alike in meaning. So you have to select two words that make sense, that complete the sentence effectively, but also mean similar things. So the question is as such. Although it does contain some pioneering ideas, one would hardly characterize the work as blank. So go ahead and figure out which two responses might work the best for this. We have one answer so far, original and innovative. Okay, it looks like the majority of the responses are C and F, which in this case are the correct answers. Original and innovative are the two that best complete the sentence that also have the same meaning. Some of these other words might also work, like eccentric. Eccentric would absolutely work to complete the sentence. However, there's not an equivalent word to eccentric in the rest of the remaining options, and so you wouldn't be able to find a second option that would also complete the sentence effectively. So these are somewhat tricky questions where you're being asked to both find complete sentences that make sense and that are alike in meaning. Trifling, I saw there was a question about what is trifling. Trifling is trivial or insignificant. Um, Yes, basically you'll want to make sure that you match as perfectly as possible the two words. So in the options that you're given, you could look for two words that are very similar in meaning and try those and see if they complete the sentence and then respond accordingly. Or you could try each word in the sentence and see how it sounds, and then try to figure out the two that sound the best that also have equivalent meanings. There's two different ways to approach this type of problem. So, again, in preparing for verbal reasoning, you're going to want to read extensively, and that just helps get your brain thinking about reading complex texts. Challenge yourself um, and make sure that you are reading newspapers and articles and novels and political blogs and things like that so that you're not only reading good, well reasoned papers and articles, but you're also reading things that are somewhat challenging and keep you informed about what's going on in the world today. One of the things, particularly on analytical writing, is that I always like to see responses that draw upon current events or issues that are happening today, as opposed to things that have been maybe 10, 20, 30 years removed from our current context. You can use both to make a good argument, but it's always nice to draw on what is happening today in the world. Vocabulary is very important, so find good practice lists and review them. You're never going to be able to find a list that covers all the vocabulary that's going to be on any given graduate record exam administration. It's just not possible. And so the vocab lists are a good starting place to review, but reading and reading in context and looking for context clues within a passage will help you learn new vocabulary as well. So please don't only read vocabulary lists and not read actual written works. It's just a terrible way to prepare for the exam. Learning common prefixes, suffixes, and root words can be helpful. So, for instance, I think one of the words in one of the examples was dispassionate. If you know what dis as a prefix means, and you know what the word passionate means, you can infer, even if you don't know the word itself, what dispassionate means. So learning those prefixes, suffixes, and root words can be very, very helpful. For the sentence equivalent section, as you read a passage, put your own word into the space as you read the sentence. So don't even look at the answers initially. Just read the sentence and put in a word that you think would work for you. And then see if that word is in the response list or something similar. I like doing this because sometimes when we read the question responses, we get caught up in how well each word works, as opposed to what we think right away is the best fit. So cover up those answers on a sentence equivalent and just read the passage and fill in the blanks in your mind and see if that word is present. Again, this is going to be a really good opportunity to take sample tests to learn what types of questions you need additional work around or what types of words are giving you the most struggle. So the sample tests that are available on the GRE website have each of the types of questions and a lot of examples of them so you can practice them effectively. So just to kind of summarize everything we've talked about for the last hour, make sure the programs, the graduate programs that you're interested in pursuing require the GRE for admission. I've talked to a few students who have applied to programs and didn't check that requirement, took the graduate record exam and paid for it, and then realized the program that they most wanted to get into did not require the GRE for admission. So they essentially wasted $200 applying for the exam and having to sit and review and take the exam when they actually didn't have to. You may find that even within the same discipline, one graduate program may require the GRE and one might not. And so you can use that to make informed decisions about which program you want to apply to. Second, plan a timeline to prepare for the GRE in accordance with application deadlines. Anticipate between 2 to 6 months to prepare, depending upon how much work you need to get up to the score that you want to get to, and at least 2 weeks to get the scores to institutions after the test has been administered. Particularly for people who are taking the test outside of the United States, they usually encourage that you provide at least a month of time between the time you take the exam and the time your application is due, just in case there are issues sending sending everything out to the actual programs. And finally, do not go into the graduate record exam having done nothing to prepare unless, and this is the one exception, if you can afford to take the exam twice and you want to take it once as practice. But I don't know why you would do that. There's so many practice exams available on the internet for free that you don't have to spend the $205 to do that. There was a question asked about the where the exam is administered, and yes, go to the GRE website and put in your location because American Corner in Pagorka is not a location where the test is administered. So back to that point though, practice for the exam. This isn't an exam that we can usually just walk into and take it. You do need to plan accordingly, prepare yourself, especially on those areas where you need the most support, and you'll improve your potential for doing well on the exam. The other thing that I would mention for this is that there are practice programs in addition to study materials. You could potentially take one of the online or in-person GRE preparation courses. Those courses are usually fairly expensive and have varied results in helping students improve their scores. So again, I think that you could probably do just as well preparing on your own with materials that you've procured on the internet. But if you do better in that type of environment where you're having somebody coach and mentor you through the process, and it's financially feasible for you, potentially look into doing one of the test preparation courses. So that's all the material I've prepared for us today, and I know it was a lot in a fairly short amount of time, but I would like to open it up for any questions that you might have using the chat feature. Igor, is that question directed to me? Or is that not that's not a question, never mind. Does anyone have any questions that you would like me to answer while we're still together today? Darinka, if I'm pronouncing your name correctly, asked, how can one tell if you get a harder second part or not? Um, there's really no way to tell. I think you'll just kind of know that either the questions feel very similar to what you experienced in the first section, or they'll feel much more difficult. There's not really a good way to indicate, and the GRE computer-based assessment will not tell you if you have gotten to open up higher, more difficult questions. So unfortunately, that's, yeah, there's really no good way to answer that. Another question came through. How similar to GRE is GMAT? I'm actually not very familiar, just to be honest, with the graduate management admissions test. Um, and I'm more familiar with the MCAT and the LSAT for those disciplines. It's supposed to be very similar. Although if you have I have read, and I'll need to look into this a little bit more, but I have read that if a program says either GRE or GMAT, that international students who English is not their first language have had an easier time on the GMAT than the GRE. And so I've seen that posted in test preparation discussion blogs a few times. So the GMAT, I've heard, is easier than the GRE for students who have English as their second or third language. A question here, is there a period for which the GRE is active? Like, for example, TOEFL is valid for 2 years. That's a great question. The GRE is available for use from 5 years from the time you took the exam. And the reason is that oftentimes students will get admission to a master's program based on their GRE score, and then they will apply to a PhD program immediately after or within a year of completing the master's program, and so they can use the same score set for admission to the PhD. The reason that I took the exam twice was because I waited 6 years between my master's and it was 7 years between my master's and my PhD. And so I had to retake it because the 5-year window had lapsed. Another question here, can one see the average results for the country? No, there actually is no way to see average results for the country, and I've not come across that in the statistical data that they produce for previous exams. More just on average, what are the scores internationally? But I've not seen any country by country averages. I can look. I'll see if maybe I can find something though for you. Yes, TOEFL does have those country by country, and I will definitely look. I'm going to write that down so I don't forget. I will look to see if GRE has country by country statistics.
Well, if no one has any more questions, I would like to thank you, Matt, on behalf of the crew that is in the American Corner today. There were in total 6 of us, and thank you so much for the rest of you who took an active part in guessing today. This was a lovely presentation. We hope to have more chances of talking to Matt and using his extensive experience. Thank you so much, Matt.
Thank you, Anita, and thank you all for joining us today.
Have a great day.
Thank you, you too.